The church in Charleston smelled of lilies and old wood polish, the kind of scent that clung to the skin and reminded you of endings. Candles flickered along the altar, casting restless shadows across the rows of pews, filled with relatives, neighbors, and the few friends my mother had left in her 70 years. I was standing at the lectern, palms trembling as I held the folded sheet of paper, trying to find the strength to read the eulogy I had written through sleepless nights. My mother had been the anchor of my life, the woman who raised me, to endure, to be loyal, to put family above all else. Her death had already carved a hollow space inside my chest, but I stood there for her, for my daughter Lily, who sat in the second row for the family name. My voice cracked as I said her name, Amanda Collins, daughter of Mary Collins, trying to keep the grief steady enough to speak. The silence of mourning is heavy, a silence that presses against your ribs until you can hardly breathe. That silence was shattered by the scrape of wood against stone. A chair moved, and before I could blink, my husband Mark was on his feet. He stood tall in his pressed navy suit, the one I had bought him for a work gala, his face expressionless, but his eyes gleaming with something cruel. People turned their heads confused, expecting him to offer condolences, perhaps to add a few words about my mother. Instead, his voice cut through the church like a blade. "I can't do this anymore," Mark announced, his tone flat, final, loud enough that the microphone on the lectern caught his words and echoed them back through the speakers. "I cannot keep pretending. I am leaving Amanda." For a moment, the world collapsed into soundless disbelief. I felt my knees weaken, my hands clutching the paper so tightly it wrinkled in my grip. Gasps filled the pews, whispers cascaded from one end of the church to the other, some women raising their hands to their mouths, men shifting uncomfortably in their seats. My daughter Lily stared at him, her young face drained of color, her eyes wide with shock and betrayal. She was only 14, too young to carry the sight of her father humiliating her mother in front of an entire congregation at her grandmother's funeral of all places. I tasted copper in my mouth, the taste of shame, of rage swallowed too quickly. The pastor froze in place, his hand still resting on the edge of the pulpit. Even the organist, who had been quietly adjusting sheet music, stopped moving. The silence, now heavy with disbelief. My heart pounded in my ears, each thud a reminder that this was not a nightmare. This was happening. Mark didn't flinch. He looked at me with something between contempt and smug relief. I had seen that look before in smaller, quieter moments, when he dismissed my ideas, when he claimed my sacrifices as his own achievements, but never with this level of cruelty. He wanted witnesses. He wanted everyone to see me broken. Tina was there too, I realized, a few pews back, dressed in black, like the rest of us, but her lips pressed together in a line that trembled between pity and victory. Tina Marshall, my so-called best friend, the woman who had shared drinks and secrets with me for decades, the woman who had stood beside me at my wedding, now sat silently, her eyes not meeting mine. The betrayal twisted deeper, slicing through what little strength I had left. A funeral is supposed to be sacred. It is supposed to be the last refuge of dignity for the grieving. But Mark had turned it into a stage for humiliation. My humiliation. My mother's death had already broken me, and now, before the coffin was even lowered into the ground, he had chosen to bury my marriage in front of everyone. I steadied my breath, forcing myself not to crumble, not to scream, not to let him win. My fingers loosened around the paper of the eulogy, and in that split second of devastation, one thought blazed through the haze of grief and rage. He believed this was the end for me, but he had no idea what I had prepared. My name is Amanda Collins, and until that moment in the church, I believed I understood sacrifice. I was 39 years old, the eldest daughter of Mary Collins, raised in Charleston, with the kind of Southern discipline that carved politeness into your bones. From the time I was young, I dreamed of designing spaces, of filling rooms with color and light, of building beauty where there had once been emptiness. I studied interior design at community college, sketched houses on napkins, walked through the historic streets of Charleston, imagining how I would restore them. But those dreams had been folded and stored away the moment I married Mark. He was charming once, or maybe I only wanted to believe he was. He carried himself with the easy confidence of a man certain he would succeed. When we married, he promised me partnership, promised me the world, and for a while, I believed him. But soon, my sketches were set aside for his spreadsheets. He needed me to hold the household together, to smooth the rough edges of his career, to stay late at dinners with clients when he felt tired, to look polished and pleasant when the bank needed a show of stability. When Lily was born, my priorities shifted entirely. She was small, fragile, and all mine. I wanted her to have stability, to grow up in a home where she felt secure. I gave up interviews for design firms so I could stay home with her. And later, when she started school, I worked part-time jobs that fit around Mark's schedule. Every choice I made circled back to his convenience. Mark rose steadily through the bank. He was praised for his charm, for his vision, for his ability to bring in clients. What no one ever saw was me sitting at the kitchen table late at night, balancing his expense reports, writing thank you notes in his name, hosting colleagues in our living room with trays of hors d'oeuvres I had prepared on a shoestring budget. He boasted about being self-made, about pulling himself up from nothing, and I bit my tongue, reminding myself that it was my role to support him. But support became sacrifice, and sacrifice became erasure. At neighborhood gatherings, people would ask what I did, and I would say, I stay home with Lily, and I help Mark when he needs it. Their smiles would falter slightly, their eyes sliding past me, as if I were invisible. Invisible was how I felt most days. Still, I convinced myself that invisibility was a small price to pay for family. My mother always told me that loyalty was the backbone of love, and I clung to that even when I saw the cracks. Mark came home later, his temper sharper, his eyes wandering. I ignored receipts that didn't add up, the faint smell of perfume that wasn't mine, the hotel points on his credit card. I told myself he was stressed, that the bank demanded more, that if I just gave a little more of myself, it would even out. The truth I couldn't admit, not to my mother, not to Lily, not even to myself, was that I was afraid. Afraid that if I pushed back, if I demanded my own voice, my own career, he would leave. And I thought losing him would mean losing everything, because for years he had made sure I believed that without him, I was nothing. So I kept choosing silence. I let my dreams gather dust in the attic stacks of sketchbooks no one ever opened. I let myself become the woman behind the man, the caretaker, the fixer, the shadow. And I told myself that this was love. Now, sitting in the front pew of the church with whispers swirling around me, I realized that every sacrifice I had made, every piece of myself I had given away, had only fed his appetite for more. And when there was nothing left of me to take, he decided to throw me away. The weeks leading up to my mother's funeral had been a blur of exhaustion and unease. Grief has a way of clouding your vision, but even through that fog, I noticed things about Mark that didn't add up. He started mentioning work trips to Savannah, always at the last minute, always with a vague explanation about meeting a client. At first, I wanted to believe him. I told myself the bank was demanding more from him, that he was stressed by rising responsibilities. But the truth seeped through in little cracks. There were hotel charges from resorts that didn't match his expense reports. I found receipts for champagne and dinners that cost more than a week's worth of groceries. When I asked, he dismissed me with that cutting tone he used when he wanted to make me feel foolish. "You wouldn't understand, Amanda. It's business. Stop worrying." I wanted to believe him, but the unease settled into my bones. Then came the moment that shattered the fragile denial I had built. I was sorting through laundry one evening when I found a silk scarf in the pocket of his suit jacket. It wasn't mine. It smelled faintly of jasmine and expensive perfume. My hands trembled as I held it, and a part of me wanted to believe it belonged to some colleague's wife, accidentally misplaced. But deep down, I knew better. The confirmation came in the cruelest way. One night, I sat down at his laptop to pay a bill. He hadn't logged out of his email. Curiosity, or maybe desperation, pushed me to click. There it was, a message chain littered with declarations of affection, hotel reservations, even pictures. My stomach dropped as I scrolled, my vision blurring. The name on the email wasn't a stranger. It was Tina Marshall. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Tina. My Tina. My best friend since high school. The woman who had stood by me at my wedding in a seafoam green bridesmaid dress. The one who had whispered jokes into my ear when I went into labor with Lily. The one who had sat in my kitchen countless nights sipping wine and pretending to care about my struggles. It wasn't just betrayal. It was annihilation. I remembered the times she had encouraged me to give Mark space, how she always seemed to defend his late nights, his cold remarks. I remembered her sly smiles, the way she looked at him sometimes when she thought I wasn't watching. Now, every one of those moments rearranged themselves into a cruel pattern I had been too blind to see. I clicked through more emails. There were plans for a condo by the beach, discussions about opening a business together, even conversations about what they would tell Lily when the time was right. My chest tightened until it felt like I was suffocating. My daughter. They were planning how to explain to my child that her mother was being replaced. I closed the laptop and sat in the silence of my kitchen, the refrigerator humming behind me, the shadows stretching across the tiled floor. Betrayal tastes metallic bitter, like copper in the back of your throat. I felt it, then sharp and cutting. The cruelest part wasn't even that Mark had betrayed me. It was that he had chosen my best friend to do it with. He had taken the one person I confided in, the one person I believed would never stab me in the back, and turned her into an accomplice. It was a double wound, sharper than I thought I could bear. That night, I lay awake, listening to the creaks of the old Charleston house, the air heavy with summer humidity. Lily slept down the hall, her breathing soft and even oblivious to the storm gathering around us. I stared at the ceiling, tears soaking into my pillow, and realized something terrifying. If I didn't act, Mark and Tina would strip me of everything: my marriage, my home, my stability, even my child. And in that dark, suffocating moment, one thought took root in my mind, like a flame They thought I was weak, but they had underestimated me. The night I discovered the truth about Mark and Tina, sleep became impossible. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with images of their emails, their laughter, their plans to build a new life, while I was left behind in ashes. Every creak of the house felt like it was mocking me. Finally, around midnight, I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Lily, and walked barefoot across the cool hardwood floor into the kitchen. The moonlight filtered through the lace curtains, pale and unforgiving. I opened Mark's laptop again, my fingers trembling as I typed in his password. He had never imagined I would look too secure in his arrogance. Within seconds, I was scrolling through months of messages. There were bank transfers I had never approved, amounts small enough not to draw attention, but steady, deliberate, like drops of poison. Each transaction went to an LLC, registered in both his and Tina's names. My throat tightened as I realized they weren't just betraying me personally. They were conspiring to dismantle everything I had worked to build. I took a deep breath and began copying files onto a flash drive. Emails, transaction records, even photographs. My hands moved faster with each discovery, a rhythm of betrayal and evidence. I printed bank statements, highlighting the transfers. The old printer in the corner hummed and clicked its light, blinking like a conspirator in the night. I tucked the warm papers into a manila folder, labeling it simply with the date. The more I uncovered, the more the betrayal bled into rage. Here was the proof of his lies, his arrogance, his belief that I was too naive, too weak, too devoted to ever question him. I remembered the smirk on his face. Earlier that week, when I asked why his shirt smelled of a perfume I didn't wear. He had brushed me off, said I was paranoid. Now, under the cold light of the computer screen, I had the proof that my instincts had been right all along. But there was more. Buried in his files, I found a draft of a separation agreement, already written, unsigned. In it, he proposed keeping the Charleston house for himself, transferring only a fraction of our savings to me, and arranging custody of Lily so she would spend more time with him and Tina. My vision blurred as I read the words. He had planned my erasure. He had turned my loyalty, my silence, my sacrifices into weapons against me. I closed the laptop and sat there in the dark, the folder of evidence heavy in my lap. My heart pounded, but there was no fear anymore, only clarity. Mark believed he had cornered me, that by humiliating me publicly, he could force me into submission, make me disappear quietly, while he paraded Tina through the streets of Charleston. But he had underestimated the one thing my mother had drilled into me since I was a child: never show your hand until the moment matters. The kitchen clock ticked past 2 a.m. as I slipped the flash drive into a drawer and locked it. I slid the folder into the bottom of a storage box marked tax records, knowing he would never look there. I wiped my tears and stared out the window at the garden my mother had loved, the roses she planted, blooming pale in the moonlight. I whispered to her memory, I won't let them take everything. When I finally crept back to bed, Lily stirred in her sleep and mumbled my name. I brushed a hand across her forehead, my chest tightening. She had no idea what was coming, how close her father and Tina were to tearing her world apart. But I would not let that happen. For her sake, for my mother's memory, for my own dignity, I would fight. Mark thought the funeral would be the scene of my humiliation. He didn't know it would be the beginning of his downfall. The next morning, I woke with swollen eyes and a fire in my chest that hadn't been there the night before. I couldn't afford to let grief paralyze me. My mother had always said, when someone shows you who they are, believed them the first time. Mark and Tina had shown me. Now it was time to believe and to act. I remembered a name whispered among women in Charleston, spoken with both respect and a hint of awe. Patricia Pat Reynolds, a divorce lawyer with nearly 30 years of experience. She was known for her sharp tongue, sharper memory, and the uncanny ability to see through lies before the liar even opened their mouth. Some said she was ruthless. Others said she was simply fair, but no one denied she was effective. I dialed her office, my hand shaking as I held the phone. Her assistant answered brisk but kind, and after I explained the situation in clipped words, she told me to come in that afternoon. Pat's office was tucked into a renovated brick building near the waterfront, its old Southern charm clashing with the modern glass desk she sat behind. She wore a navy blazer, silver hair cut blunt at her chin, and a pair of glasses she peered over as I entered. Her eyes were sharp, appraising, but not unkind. "Mrs. Collins," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "You look like a woman carrying a very heavy secret. Let's see if I can help lighten the load." I slid the manila folder across the desk. She opened it, scanning the bank statements, the printed emails, the draft of the separation agreement. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and then, to my surprise, she gave a low chuckle. "Well," she said, tapping one finger against the prenup document I had included, "your husband is ambitious, but not very clever. You see this clause, fidelity clause, Section 14. If either spouse is found guilty of infidelity, they forfeit their claim to marital property. Did he draft this with his attorney, or was it standard?" "It was his idea," I admitted, remembering the smug look on Mark's face when he had insisted on it before our wedding. "He said it was to protect him." Pat leaned back in her chair, her eyes glittering with amusement. "Then, my dear, he has built his own trap. With the evidence you've gathered, this case won't just tilt in your favor. It will collapse entirely on his side. You'll keep the house, the majority of your assets, and custody of Lily. He'll walk away with nothing but his pride, and I suspect even that won't last." For the first time in days, I felt my chest loosen. Relief didn't come easily, but it flickered there, small and bright. "So what do we do?" I asked. Pat clasped her hands together, her voice firm. "We wait. Let him make his announcement, dig his own grave publicly. When he thinks he has stripped you of dignity, that's when we strike. The court will not look kindly on a man who humiliates his wife at her mother's funeral while already parading his mistress around town. Timing is everything, Amanda. Hold steady. Keep gathering. And when the moment comes, we'll put the rope around his neck, figuratively speaking, of course." Her words sank into me, stealing me. I wasn't just a grieving widow's daughter anymore. I was a woman preparing for battle. As I left her office, the Charleston air pressed hot and heavy, the scent of salt from the harbor mixing with car exhaust. I clutched my folder tighter, walking faster. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt dangerous. Mark thought I was broken. He thought he had control. But thanks to Pat Reynolds, I had a weapon he couldn't see. And when the time came, I would use it. In the days before my mother's funeral, the air in Charleston felt heavier than usual, thick with August humidity, and thicker still with the weight of whispers. Mark had stopped pretending. Where once he came home late with half-hearted excuses, now he barely bothered at all. He left early in the morning with a crisp shirt and an unfamiliar cologne, and when I asked if he would be home for dinner, he smirked. "Don't wait up." The smirk was worse than the lie. It didn't take long before word spread in our close-knit town. Charleston thrives on reputation and scandal. feeds its gossip lines faster than summer thunderstorms roll across the harbor. I caught neighbors lowering their voices as I passed at the grocery store, saw two women I'd known since Lily was in kindergarten tilt their heads together like sparrows sharing crumbs. They weren't whispering sympathy, they were whispering judgment. Amanda must not have been enough to keep him. Amanda must have let herself fade. Even at church, where I had always found refuge, the warmth turned cold. A deacon's wife, who used to hug me tightly at every service, barely nodded from across the pews. Another old friend turned her eyes away entirely. I felt stripped bare, invisible, all at once. The betrayal cut deeper when I saw Tina. She no longer hid her involvement. At a neighborhood gathering, she appeared at Mark's side, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her laugh ringing across the porch like she had won a prize. She looked at me once, just once, and in that look was a triumph so raw I nearly lost my breath. But the cruelest moment came when Lily found the truth herself. I had tried so hard to shield her, to protect her from her father's choices. But one evening, while doing homework on the family iPad, she stumbled across a message thread synced from Mark's phone. I found her sitting frozen at the kitchen table, the screen glowing in front of her, tears streaking her cheeks. "Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking, Is Dad in love with Aunt Tina?" The world tilted. I pulled her into my arms, her body shaking against mine. For a moment, I wished I could lie, but lies had already poisoned our family. "Yes, sweetheart," I murmured, stroking her hair. "He made choices that were wrong, but none of it is your fault. None of it touches how much I love you." She cried until she had no tears left, then lifted her chin with a determination that startled me. "Then, I'm with you, Mom, no matter what happens." In that instant, I realized the betrayal had given me something unexpected clarity. Mark thought he had turned everyone against me, but Lily's loyalty was unshakable. She was my anchor now, just as my mother had once been. As the day of the funeral drew near, Mark became bolder. He mentioned to Lily that soon things will be different, hinting at a life where Tina was part of our household. He spoke to me like a man rehearsing his victory speech, confident that the humiliation he planned at the funeral would end any resistance I had left. But he didn't know what I carried. He didn't know that every receipt, every email, every plan he had made with Tina was locked away in a folder, ready to be revealed when the time was right. And he certainly didn't know that Pat Reynolds was waiting in the wings, ready to bring the full force of the law down on him. Charleston is a city that never forgets a scandal, and Mark was writing his own downfall in bold strokes. He thought the funeral would be my breaking point. What he didn't realize was that it would become his stage of exposure. The day of the funeral arrived, cloaked in heavy summer heat, the kind that clung to your skin and turned every breath into labor. Charleston's oldest church stood solemn, under a sky the color of slate, its bells tolling slow, mournful chimes as guests filed into the wooden pews. I wore a black dress that had once belonged to my mother, its hem brushing my ankles, a pearl necklace resting against my throat like armor. My daughter Lily sat beside me, her small hands clutching mine, her 14-year-old eyes wide with grief and fear. The sanctuary filled with the muted rustle of programs, the faint scent of lilies, the coughs of elderly mourners. My mother's casket lay at the front polished oak, catching the dim light of the candles. I had spent the morning rehearsing the words I wanted to speak, a eulogy meant to honor her strength, her sacrifices, the way she had held our family together. Through storms, I could barely recall, without tears. I wanted the day to be about her, about memory, about respect. But Mark had other plans. He entered the church late, drawing every gaze. His navy suit was pressed, his tie perfectly knotted, and on his arm, though she tried to keep her distance, was Tina. She wore black like the rest of us, but the cut of her dress clung in a way that felt like defiance. The air in the sanctuary shifted a ripple of discomfort, running through the rows as people recognized her. Whispers rose, subdued but sharp. I felt Lily's grip tighten on my hand. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. I squeezed her fingers, keeping my eyes fixed forward. I would not give him the satisfaction of a reaction. When it was my turn, I walked to the lectern. My knees wobbled, but I steadied myself, unfolding the paper I had written and smoothing its creases with deliberate care. I began to speak, my voice low, the words trembling, but clear stories of my mother's laughter, her strength, her endless belief in loyalty and honesty. For a few brief minutes, I felt her presence wrap around me like a shield. Then came the scrape of wood against stone. A chair moved. Footsteps echoed. Mark rose from his pew and walked down the aisle. He didn't wait for me to finish. He didn't care that I was mid-sentence, that the room was heavy with mourning. He stood just a few feet from the casket and raised his voice. "I can't do this anymore." He announced, his tone sharp and final, the microphone amplifying his words until they reverberated through the church. "I cannot keep pretending. I am leaving Amanda." The sanctuary gasped as one. Programs slipped from hands. A woman stifled a cry. An older man muttered something sharp under his breath. I froze, the eulogy crumpling in my fists. My mouth went dry, the copper taste of humiliation burning the back of my tongue. Lily let out a sound, a strangled mix of shock and pain that cut me deeper than any of his words. She turned her face into my shoulder, her small body trembling as if the ground beneath her had shifted. Mark's eyes swept the room, lingering on me with a look of cold triumph. He wanted this. He wanted the congregation to see me destroyed, to watch me unravel in front of them. He wanted to bury me alongside my mother. And then I saw Tina, still seated in the pew. Her chin raised, her expression unreadable, but her lips twitching with the ghost of a smile. Betrayal sat smugly in her posture, a cruel shadow behind Mark's arrogance. The pastor stood frozen, torn between decorum and shock. My family members stared, some in disbelief, others in pity. The air seemed to hum with anticipation. What would I do? What would I say? How would Amanda Collins recover from this moment? But I did not cry. I did not shout. I did not give Mark the public collapse he craved. Instead, I folded the eulogy, placed it on the lectern, and lifted my chin. My silence became my weapon. In that stillness, I could feel his smirk falter, just for a second. He thought this was his victory, his grand announcement. What he didn't know was that I held his ruin in a folder waiting at home, a folder that would turn his gloating into ashes. I stepped down from the lectern, took Lily's hand, and returned to my seat. The whispers grew louder, questions buzzing in the air, but inside me, beneath the grief and humiliation, a spark burned steady. He believed he had ended me in front of everyone. He had no idea it was only the beginning of his downfall. The funeral ended in a haze of murmurs and sidelong glances. People avoided my eyes as they passed, offering weak condolences that sounded more like pity. Some didn't speak at all. I kept my hand tight on Lily's shoulder as we walked out beneath the sweltering Charleston sun, the cicadas screaming from the trees, as though mocking the silence that had swallowed me in the church. Mark lingered outside, greeting people like a man who had just delivered a victorious speech rather than shattered his family in public. Tina stood a few paces away, speaking softly with one of Mark's colleagues, her black dress clinging like a shadow. I didn't say a word. Not in the car ride home. Not when neighbors passed and glanced at our driveway. Lily sat curled in the back seat, her face pressed against the window, refusing to speak to her father. Mark tried to start small talk, but even he seemed aware of the sharp wall of silence I had built around us. That evening, when the sun dipped low and painted the windows in orange and gold, Mark finally cornered me in the kitchen. He poured himself a drink, the ice clinking against crystal, and leaned against the counter with a casualness that made my skin crawl. "Well," he said, swirling the glass, "everyone knows now. It's out in the open. You don't have to pretend anymore, Amanda. We can stop this charade. I'll be moving in with Tina soon, and you'll figure something out." I turned from the sink, slowly, my hands still damp from washing dishes. His arrogance filled the room, suffocating. "Figure something out," I repeated softly. He smirked, sipping his drink. "You'll be fine. Maybe you'll get some part-time job. Maybe the court will give you a little something to keep you comfortable. But the house, the accounts, they'll be mine. Lily will adjust. Kids do." Lily, listening from the stairs, let out a small sob before rushing to her room. I felt the sound like a knife through my ribs, but I held my ground. I walked past him to the dining table, pulled open the drawer, and retrieved the manila folder I had hidden beneath tax forms. I set it down in front of him with a deliberate thud. Mark frowned, setting his glass aside. "What's this?" "Proof," I said, my voice steady, though my heart thundered. "Emails, bank transfers, hotel reservations, photographs. And this," I slid the prenup across the table, the familiar signatures staring back at us. Section 14, Fidelity Clause. He blinked confusion, flashing across his face, before morphing into anger. "You went through my things." "I protected myself," I replied. My eyes didn't leave his. "You thought you could humiliate me at my mother's funeral and walk away with everything. But you forgot one very important detail. You signed this prenup. You signed your own sentence the moment you decided to betray me." His face reddened. He grabbed the papers, flipping through them, his hands trembling, despite his attempt at control. "This won't hold. Courts don't always enforce these things." "They will," I said calmly, "especially with this much evidence. Especially when your mistress is my best friend. Especially after you humiliated me in front of an entire congregation. Judges in Charleston don't look kindly on men who destroy families in public." The silence between us stretched, taut. I could see the cracks forming in his bravado, the realization dawning that the empire he thought he had built with Tina was already crumbling. Mark slammed the folder shut, his jaw tight. "You think you've won?" he hissed. I leaned forward, my voice cold. "No, Mark. I don't think. I know." For the first time in years, I watched his confidence falter. It was fleeting, a flicker in his eyes, but it was enough. I picked up the folder, tucked it back under my arm, and walked away, leaving him standing in the kitchen with nothing but the sound of melting ice and his own unraveling certainty. Charleston's courthouse was an imposing structure, its white columns stretching toward a cloudless September sky. On the morning of the hearing, the air buzzed with humidity and anticipation. I walked up the stone steps with Lily at my side, her small hand tucked firmly in mine. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back in a braid, her young face drawn with worry, but also with the fierce determination she had inherited from my mother. Patricia Pat Reynolds met us at the doors, a thick leather portfolio in her grip, her silver hair gleaming in the sunlight. She gave me a nod, calm and steady, the kind of nod that said we were ready. Inside the courtroom smelled faintly of varnished wood and old paper. The judge presided from his bench, his glasses perched low on his nose, his expression stern but unreadable. The pew-like benches filled quickly with spectators, neighbors, former friends, even a few co-workers from the bank who clearly couldn't resist witnessing the scandal firsthand. Whispers rippled through the room as Mark entered, flanked by his attorney. He wore a suit more expensive than we could afford, his tie knotted with precision, but his eyes betrayed the tension beneath. Behind him, Tina slipped into the gallery, her presence impossible to ignore. She kept her chin high, but the way her fingers twisted around her purse strap betrayed her nerves. Pat rose first, her voice firm as she laid out the case. She presented the prenup signed years earlier, her finger tapping the bolded words of Section 14 infidelity shall result in forfeiture of marital property claims. Then she slid forward the folder I had built in the quiet of sleepless nights. The bank statements with highlighted transfers, the hotel invoices, the printed email threads, even the draft separation agreement Mark had hidden on his computer. Each piece of paper was a blade cutting away at the facade Mark had built. The gallery shifted with every exhibit, murmurs swelling like waves. The judge adjusted his glasses, his frown deepening. Mark's attorney tried to object, painting me as paranoid, insisting the fidelity clause was outdated and rarely enforced. He argued that the transfers were business-related, that Tina was simply a colleague, that any suggestion otherwise was slander. But when Pat called the bank's compliance officer to the stand, the story unraveled. The officer confirmed that the LLC Mark had funded with steady withdrawals was indeed registered under both his and Tina's names. Then came the photographs, grainy but unmistakable. Mark and Tina holding hands at a Savannah resort, their smiles careless, their betrayal immortalized. The gasp that went through the courtroom echoed off the walls. The judge held up the prenup, his voice resonant. "Mr. Collins, this agreement is clear. You signed it willingly. You acknowledged its terms. Infidelity forfeits your right to marital assets. The evidence presented leaves little room for doubt." Mark shifted in his seat, his face flushed crimson. His attorney leaned in, whispering frantically, but the judge silenced them with a raised hand. In light of the overwhelming evidence, this court awards Mrs. Amanda Collins sole ownership of the marital home in Charleston, 70% of all shared financial assets, and full custody of the minor child, Lily Collins. Mr. Collins retains no claim to these properties or funds under the terms of the prenup. The gavel struck once sharp as a gunshot. The room erupted in whispers, shock mingled with satisfaction. I exhaled slowly, my shoulders finally loosening, though my heart still thundered in my chest. I turned to Lily, who clutched my arm, her eyes wide with relief. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to smile. Mark, however, looked gutted. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched against the table, but there was no fight left in him. He stared at me across the courtroom with a mixture of rage and disbelief, as though he couldn't fathom that the woman he had dismissed as weak had just dismantled him piece by piece in front of the entire city. Tina rose quietly from the jury, her eyes flicking to Mark with something cold, calculating. She didn't wait for him. She slipped out of the courtroom alone, her heels clicking against the tile, leaving him to drown in the wreckage of his pride. As Pat gathered her papers, she leaned close to me. "Justice served," she said simply. And for the first time since the funeral, I believed her. In Charleston, reputation is a kind of currency, and once it is spent, it is nearly impossible to earn back. After the gavel fell, Mark's fall from grace was as swift as it was brutal. At first, he tried to carry himself as though nothing had changed. He returned to the bank in his tailored suits, expecting the same deference from colleagues who had once laughed at his jokes and praised his vision. But whispers traveled faster than numbers in a ledger. The story of his public humiliation at the funeral, of his affair with my best friend, and of the prenup that stripped him bare, spread across town like wildfire. Within a week, clients began pulling their accounts, unwilling to entrust their money to a man branded unfaithful and reckless. The bank's board called an emergency meeting. By the end of the month, Mark was resigning to pursue other opportunities. He blamed me, of course. He cornered me outside the courthouse. One afternoon, his eyes bloodshot, his voice harsh. "You ruined me, Amanda. You took everything." I didn't flinch. I only looked him in the eye and said, "You ruined yourself." Tina's departure came even quicker. The night after the hearing, she vanished from his side. A neighbor told me they had seen her loading her car with boxes, refusing to answer Mark's desperate calls. By the time he tracked her down at her sister's house in Mount Pleasant, she had already blocked his number. She wasn't interested in a man stripped of his house, his money, and his influence. Whatever fantasy they had spun together dissolved the moment the reality of his empty pockets sank in. Left without her, without his job, and without the house he had once boasted about at cocktail parties. Mark rented a shabby one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. The man who had once demanded the finest bourbon now drank cheap whiskey alone. He drove a car with a dented fender, a far cry from the polished vehicles he used to flaunt. Even his friends turned their backs. At first, a few tried to maintain ties, but Charleston is small, and scandal stains everything it touches. Wives whispered to their husbands not to be seen with him. Invitations stopped arriving. At social gatherings, Mark's name became a punchline, muttered with disdain. I learned these details, not because I sought them out, but because people told me. At the grocery store, at church, at the farmer's market, someone always leaned close to share another story of his decline. "Have you heard?" they'd say. "Mark's down to working freelance consulting, but no one wants to hire him. Tina's gone, isn't she?" figures. Their words carried a mix of pity and satisfaction, but I didn't linger on them. His downfall wasn't my celebration, it was his consequence. The hardest part was Lily. She struggled with the whiplash of seeing her father fall from the pedestal she had once placed him on. At 14, she understood betrayal, but not yet the complicated layers of adult failure. She cried sometimes, asking why he had chosen Tina over us, why he had tried to replace the family we had built. I held her even when I didn't have answers, and reminded her that his choices had nothing to do with her worth. Mark tried to reach out to her, of course. Phone calls, texts, even showing up outside her school once. But Lily refused to see him. "Not until he apologizes to you, Mom," she said firmly. surprising me with her resolve. In her young heart, she carried the justice that Charleston had already delivered. For Mark, there was no apology, only regret, too tangled in pride to ever come out clean. And so his world grew smaller, darker, until all that remained of the man who had strutted through Charleston society was a hollow shell, sitting alone in a cheap apartment, haunted by the empire he had tried to build on betrayal. When the court battle was behind me, and the whispers around town began to fade, I finally turned my attention to something I had ignored for far too long, myself. For months, my life had revolved around Mark's deceit and the wreckage he left in his wake. But once the dust settled, I realized I had a chance to build something different, not grand or showy, not the kind of victory splashed across headlines, but a quieter life that actually belonged to me. The Charleston house, my mother's house, became my sanctuary. For weeks after the ruling, I walked from room to room in silence, relearning the contours of the space without Mark's shadow looming over it. The kitchen smelled of lemon cleaner, the walls still bore faint dents from Lily's toys, and the garden out back had grown wild since my mother's passing. One Saturday morning, Lily and I pulled on gloves and set to work, trimming hedges, planting new roses, and reviving the herb garden my mother had once tended. By sundown, dirt streaked our arms, and Lily's laugh rang across the yard. For the first time in months, I laughed with her, the sound startling and healing all at once. Financially, the settlement gave me breathing room, but I didn't want to rely on that forever. I returned to the dream I had tucked away when I married Mark Design. I pulled my old sketchbooks from the attic, the pages filled with lines and colors that still felt alive. With Lily cheering me on, I cleared out the garage and set up a makeshift studio. A wooden sign I painted myself hung above the door Collins Interiors. At first, I took on small projects, helping a neighbor rearrange her living room painting cabinets for a friend. Word of mouth in Charleston spreads quickly, and soon more people called. They didn't want Mark's name or reputation. They wanted mine. Each project reminded me that I still had talent, still had something to offer beyond sacrifice. When I laid out fabrics across a client's table or showed them how light could transform a space, I felt whole again. Life with Lily became simpler but stronger. We developed routines that belonged to us alone. Early morning walks along the Ashley River Saturday, trips to the farmer's market evenings spent cooking together, while music played low in the background. She confided in me more, now telling me about school crushes, about her fears for the future, about how betrayed she had felt by her father. Some nights, she asked if things would ever be normal again. I told her gently, "No, sweetheart. But we'll make something better than normal. We'll make it ours." Charleston society, the same one that had once whispered about my humiliation, began to view me differently. Women I barely knew approached me with quiet admiration, telling me they had followed my story, that they wished they had my courage. Some asked if I could recommend Pat Reynolds as a lawyer. Others just said, "You give me hope." Their words didn't inflate me. They grounded me. They reminded me that my fight hadn't just been for me, but for every woman who had ever been silenced, erased, or humiliated. At night, when Lily was asleep, I often sat in the garden with a cup of tea, the air humming with crickets. The roses we planted bloomed brighter than I remembered. I thought of my mother, of how she would have smiled to see me reclaiming not just the house, but my own life. I whispered into the night, "I'm okay, Mom. I'm really okay." The life I built after Mark wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a headline or a fortune, but it was steady, honest, and mine. And for the first time in years, that was enough. It was a gray Sunday afternoon when Mark appeared at the gate of the Charleston house. I was kneeling in the garden hands, deep in the soil, planting late autumn herbs with Lily beside me. She spotted him first, her face tightening as she whispered, "Mom, it's Dad." I wiped my hands on a rag heart, steady, and looked up. He stood there, with shoulders slumped, a man shrunken by his own choices. His once perfect suit had been replaced with a wrinkled shirt and jeans that didn't quite fit. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face pale. For the first time, he looked small. "Amanda," he called voice hoarse. "Please, can we talk?" Lily stiffened, but I rested a hand on her shoulder. "Go inside for a moment, sweetheart," I said gently. She hesitated, then nodded, disappearing into the kitchen, with the door closing softly behind her. I rose slowly, brushing dirt from my hands. Mark stepped closer to the gate, but didn't enter. He seemed to know he no longer belonged here. "I made a mistake," he said, words tumbling out. "I should never have left. I should never have. Tina, the money, the show, it was all a disaster. She's gone. Everyone's gone. I don't have anyone left." His voice cracked desperation, spilling out. "But you were always there. Can't we try again?" The irony of it nearly made me laugh. He had chosen the stage of my mother's funeral to strip me of dignity. Now he stood in the dirt of her garden, begging for scraps of mercy. I kept my voice calm, even. "Mark, you didn't just make a mistake. You made a choice. You chose to betray me with my best friend. You chose to humiliate me in front of an entire congregation while my mother's coffin lay at the altar. You chose to believe I was too weak to fight back." He flinched, the truth stinging sharper than any insult. "I was wrong," he whispered. "I see that now. Please, Amanda, I don't want to be alone." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought of the nights I stayed up balancing his accounts, of the scarf that wasn't mine, of Lily, crying in the kitchen, with an iPad glowing in her hands. I thought of my mother's voice, steady and strong. Loyalty means nothing without honesty. Finally, I shook my head. "It's too late, Mark. My mother always told me that honesty is the only inheritance no one can steal. You gave yours away willingly, and now you're left with exactly what you earned." His face crumpled, a mix of rage and sorrow, but he didn't argue. He turned, shoulders bowed, and walked back down the street. I watched until he disappeared around the corner, swallowed by the gray afternoon. Inside, Lily peeked through the window. "Is he gone?" "Yes," I said softly, smiling at her. "He's gone." She came back out, kneeling beside me, slipping her hands into the soil. Together, we planted the last row of herbs, the scent of rosemary and thyme rising in the damp air. The world felt quieter, lighter, as if the house itself had exhaled. Later that evening, we ate dinner at the worn oak table, just the two of us. Lily told me about a new art project at school, her eyes glowing with excitement. I listened, truly listened, not distracted by fear or shame. My life was no longer consumed by betrayal. It was rooted in small, steady joys, the laughter of my daughter, the smell of fresh earth, the freedom of knowing I had survived. Poetic justice had been served not in wealth or vengeance, but in the simple peace of reclaiming my life.